We do want to talk a little bit more about some rugby today. Neil Francis has an interesting piece in the Irish Independent where he's talking about David Nucifora and the relationship that Nucifora has with the provinces in the aftermath of the movement that we've seen over the last couple of weeks. In particular, Leinster are losing a couple of props, and one in particular who's obviously somebody that they've invested a lot of time and energy and effort in bringing over to this part of the world and seeing him develop. And as soon as he gets to the level where you're like, okay, this might be a player who makes an impact over the next season or two, Salano is heading off to Munster. And the headline is, sooner or later a call from Nucifora will cause conflict. I suspect there's already been conflict in the provinces with the national team, and there's always going to be this tension, right?
You would have thought so. Like, the point that Neil Francis is making this morning is that Leinster might actually be short, which is not something we've associated with the province in recent times whatsoever. It's with the tight heads that are at their disposal, with Salano now going to Munster. It takes away one of the options that they thought they would have had 6, but actually that may dwindle. And he makes the point that Lou said you could have an aging Cian Healy, and Andrew Porter may actually shift across because he might get more test appearances at that position, with Tadhg Furlong still around for a few years. So that leaves him a little bit empty at the other side of the scrum. He's making a point that he goes off with the Leinster playbook in his back pocket. And you would imagine that people involved in Leinster aren't too happy with this at all, given the investment that they've put into a lot of young players. And you would probably make the point, I'd imagine, I don't want to put words into your mouth, that there is almost a punishment for the success of the academy and the success of the conveyor belt that they've got going on in the province.
Well, if this continues to happen, why do you invest time and energy and effort into it? What's the point of that? Is there not a moral hazard at some point where you're like, okay, I'm going to develop all these players and it's my job to do it, and we might get a third of them through, even though we want all of them to come through?
You don't want to be putting across this idea that Leinster will bring through whatever 20 players, and out of those 20 players, the best 7 or 8 will become starters down through the years in a variety of positions, and then the remaining 13 or so will then get scattered across the rest of the provinces. It doesn't look good. In fairness, it isn't something that represents Irish rugby well as a whole. It's just the way the cards are stacked at the moment. There is just an unbelievable depth of options throughout the schools game in Leinster, throughout the resources that are available at Leinster, that this is the way it is always going to be. And like, I think Francis makes this point as well, that Nucifora got a brand new contract. He looked like he was doing really, really well when Joe Schmidt was doing really, really well. And perhaps if things start to take a little bit of a downturn for a while, perhaps Ireland come back to a base level, as some people would put it, over the next few years. Perhaps then we'll start to look into a little bit more how well or how poorly Nucifora is performing. And like, that's going to be an interesting question, especially because he didn't really take much of the blame after the disaster of the Rugby World Cup last year. So
he certainly didn't accept any of the blame, and he did say that when he was asked, who is reviewing your performance, he was like, oh, that's a good question. And I'm paraphrasing there just for the sake of accuracy. So it is interesting that his success or failure is not something that we know how it's judged. We don't know how the IRFU regards his performance. He set the team needs to reach a semi-final for the World Cup to be successful. That was, spoken about, and he essentially set that mark. And I think everybody accepts that is the mark. But if you're in charge of the team reaching the semi-final, essentially, you pick the coach, you understand which players get contracts, which provinces they play for. Maybe he didn't pick the coach per se, but certainly the coach seemed to be reporting to him, and he was on the pitch with the coach in coaching gear. Like, what is the specifics of the role, I suspect, is the question that we don't really know the answer to, and how is that judged? A success or failure?
True. Like, if you're in Nucifora's position and your role is for the general benefit of Irish rugby, and that is marked by the test team doing well, you are going to be making similar decisions. If you see that there is a talented prop who is 6th choice for their province, and you see that another province in Ireland is perhaps struggling at that position, or that young, promising player might actually get more of an opportunity there, you might actually shuffle the deck to do it. You can see why Nucifora makes these decisions. Also, as well, let's face it, despite these decisions being made, there is still a distance between Leinster and the other three provinces. Who are we to say that we're not at peak player movement? Like, who's to say that, like, this is not, that the floodgates aren't opening? Like, maybe the floodgates are currently open. Like, I know you want to kind of put forward the idea that everybody will be up for grabs that comes through the Leinster school system, and people will start being divvied up. The best player will always go on to play for Leinster if they're produced through the Leinster Academy. Like, there is still a situation here where if a player moves between the provinces, they are not first choice for Leinster.
But hang on.
Because of that, Leinster will always have their number one position as the province in Ireland.
You don't know that the 23-year-old prop isn't going to be the best prop at 26. Like, you probably want to keep that guy around to see what the level of evolution and development for that individual is, particularly a prop, right? And at out half, right? Clearly, at prop and out half, you want to give players time to mature. Everybody else, you kind of have a fair idea. I see the markers here. I see the career progression. I have a fair idea where they're going to go. But at these two positions, I actually, it was really fascinating to hear Brian O'Driscoll recently talking about being, I wasn't a member of the Leinster Academy, I was a member of the National Academy. James Collin, likewise, on Sunday, speaking with Neil Tracy a couple of Sundays back, spoke about being a member of the National Academy at underage level. And I wonder if actually the future here is not to have a Leinster, Munster, Ulster and Connacht Academy, but to continue to have the same amount of investment in those players, and actually they all have national contracts at that point. I don't know, I wonder if there's some way of doing that so that you actually remove the sense that you're building players just for this club. Because ultimately, if you're not, then everybody should know that from the start. And at that point, the freedom of movement becomes something that graduating class graduates at 19, 20, 21, or whatever it is. You move up a year or you don't, you move up another year or you don't. Or they figure that like there's a dearth somewhere and you get moved around. And then it becomes a very natural thing to move. Now it's like you bring people up in a culture and you flip them to a different culture and expect them to thrive, and generally maybe they do, but like why would I continue to build resources for my rivals? That's the issue.
Well, you're building resources for yourself as well. Let's not forget, you are going to reap the benefits of your own academy. Like, you will still get the cream of the crop as you see it at the age of 21 to 23. I accept your point that you can't tell how good a player is going to be in many positions, even at the age of 23. But you can make a good guess. You can employ the best coaches in the world to help you make that guess. You've got Stuart Lancaster, you've got Leo Cullen to go to the training park and make that guess for you, to actually look at which of these kids would you like to have? Which of these kids would you like to have if you could have 20 players in a position? But we're in Ireland, this is the situation. It's not ideal, of course it's not, but the cards are stacked in your favour. You can pick your hand. You can pick pocket aces, Leinster. You can give the pocket tens to Munster. Maybe a couple of more tens will throw up when the cards in the middle of the table are turned up, but you don't know what's going to happen down the line. You can give yourself the best opportunity to have the best team. You still have the odds stacked in your favour as Leinster. I agree, it's not an ideal situation. And the National Academy, I think that's actually a really good idea, because that way, you're getting people ready to hopefully put on the green jersey one day. That's a definite. Whereas in the Leinster Academy, you're not necessarily creating players to put on the blue jersey, because that might never happen. So I think that's a good idea. But I still think in the current situation, it does seem a bit rich that people are complaining about what other players might be doing when they go to other provinces. It's not ideal that those other provinces aren't as amazingly stacked as Leinster, but that isn't going to change for a whole range of reasons for the time being.
Well, look, I guess the question is, are the provinces doing enough on their own, and is the IRFU doing enough to help the provinces to reach a level where they're able to become self-sustaining? Sure, there's always going to be a bottleneck and there's going to be too many players in one position, and at that point natural selection should out, but it seems like we haven't reached the natural selection just yet here, where this player wanted to leave because he wasn't getting game time. It seemed like Jordy Murphy wanted to leave because he wasn't getting game time and he wanted to play in the World Cup, so away you go. Likewise with Jack McGrath. Totally natural where they've reached that stage of their career. But when it's players who you haven't seen the potential for just yet, you kind of throw your hat at it and go, like, Man United are not developing players for Manchester City. They just aren't. And if the competition between the provinces is not real, what's the point of watching the provinces?
for Joey Carberry and Johnny Sexton going toe-to-toe, Sexton pulling Carberry by the shirt. That seemed like a pretty real rivalry.
Like, in that one instance, these two players were battling for the same position after a player has moved. Did he want to move? You know, like the Johnny Sexton Ronan O'Gara rivalry, they became friends later on. Like, I don't know the point of that. I guess I'm saying Man United and Man City are not swapping academy players who are going to go on and represent each other, because there's a real proper rivalry between these two. It turns out the provinces are like brothers in arms who are all trying to, you know, essentially win for Ireland together. For me, it just diminishes those matches and the intensity of those matches. And we're about to enter a period where we're going to have to watch a lot of those games going, that guy used to play for that team and that guy used to play for that team. And actually, they're all really from the same area. But sense of identity and place is hugely important to these other two teams, even though half that team is actually from Dublin.
Well, the Manchester City-Manchester United comparison, they're not being brought up to represent Ireland in the final place or to represent a single country. They don't have a union over their head that has their own interests. And you can't just ignore... Like, Nucifora isn't going in here saying, what is the worst job I can possibly do? You can see what he is trying to achieve with all of this. We gave him credit, and he deserves a lot of credit for, I think, the way Joe Schmidt was stacked, at least going into that Grand Slam year of 2018. Like, a vast array of options as a result of how pawns have been moved around the provinces. Your point, of course, there was truth in the fact that perhaps, it's not a perhaps, it's a definite, that the provincial game won't thrive as a result of this process. But I still think you can have an excellent rivalry that exists between these provinces. You can't have a brilliant situation in every aspect of the game. You can try and strive for an outstanding international team, which is clearly the number one priority here. And in the meantime, try not to mess up the rivalry between the provinces too much. In my opinion, they haven't done that whatsoever. I think there's been some great battles between Leinster and Munster in particular over recent years. I think as long as fans are there to support their teams, and there will always be Munster fans, and there will always be Leinster fans, and there will always be a rivalry. Yeah,
I'm not sure. I think that this kind of stuff just chips away at it. I don't have the solution straight off the bat, but I think it's definitely worth considering. The one other thing is, like, the point of Neil Francis's piece is that anybody with a foreign accent comes along and tells us what to do, and we're all lemmings and we go for it. That, like, essentially, he has an anecdote about Gary Ella being the Leinster coach and talking about changing the Leinster Schools rugby coach. Leinster Schools Rugby Club. The one thing you would ask is whether or not Australian rugby is exactly where we should be looking for guidance, or even New Zealand rugby at the moment. Like, we need our own rugby culture, and we need to know exactly what that rugby culture is and to define that, because we can't keep looking outside all the time. Look outside for ideas. Look outside for new coaching trends and analysis. But, like, what do we stand for ourselves? At some point, you need to stand up and have your own identity. If you look at the success of the Dublin footballers, if you look at the success of Kilkenny, they've taken stuff from everywhere else, but they've built it on their own principles. This is who we are. We're Cork, right? Like, when Cork were good, they had an innate Corkness. Over the last while, they've kind of gone away from that. What does Irish rugby stand for? What is our identity? What is Leinster's identity? Very clear, I would say. And absolutely, they needed some foreign coaching to help them get off that. But it wasn't that, like, they took something just from Randwick and said, we're going to go with this. It was the best of what Leinster had to offer with a little bit mixed in. We're going to do a full hour on Australian rugby between 9 and 10 this morning, so maybe we shouldn't labour this anymore. But if you've got one last point there on it you wanted to get in on, go for it.
No, you made the point there as well. Like, it's just important to point out how you can use foreign coaching in such an unbelievably beneficial way.
100%.
And I know that's not the point you're making at all.
Exactly.
But it's like you look at Stuart Lancaster, you look at Pat Lam. Like, if there is a better stencil.
Pat Lam's a great example. Pat Lam came in and said, what makes Connacht Connacht? I'm going to build on that, exactly. And I'm going to bring you my philosophy, and then we're going to share that collectively, and everybody's going to have to buy into it. And you hope that what's happening here is that the erosion of the values which make Munster Munster and Leinster Leinster aren't happening to the point where it doesn't actually matter where you're from. Because that's the one thing that Irish rugby has that other rugby countries don't have, that make the provinces good. And the provinces have been really good. And I understand that the national team is where you make all your money, right? And the provinces probably couldn't survive if they didn't have the injection of cash. But the thing that makes the national team good is that the provinces are good, and that they're strong, and they have a sense of identity, and that rivalry is completely real between those two provinces. When you erode that, you risk, it is a pyramid, and you're taking away the foundations of that pyramid, and it could collapse. I'm not saying it's going to. I'm sure that they'll be able to fix it, and if this policy doesn't work in 5 years' time, it won't be too late to go back. But in the meantime, I can't imagine what it must be like to work in the Leinster Academy, put hours and hours and hours into an individual who then gets good and gets whipped away from you, and you're like, what? Like, what's the point of that?
Well, it must be pretty good to work there when you put hours and hours and hours into an individual, and the best ones actually go on to lift the Champions Cup for Leinster, because that happens quite a bit.
Right. Let's move on. 21 minutes past 8 here this morning.